the king of late night and the secrets behind the curtain. For decades, Johnny Carson was more than a television host. He was the king of late night, the man Americans invited into their homes night after night. His charm was effortless, his wit sharp, and his ability to make guests comfortable, or squirm, was unmatched. Sitting in the guest chair across from Carson was a rite of passage for every star of the golden age of Hollywood and beyond. To the public, it was all laughs, applause, and glamour. But behind the curtain, Carson was not just a comedian. He was a gatekeeper, a man who knew the secrets of the industry better than anyone else. Because Carson saw it all. For 30 years on The Tonight Show, he sat across from Hollywood's biggest names. They confided in him, joked with him, and occasionally revealed more than they intended. Carson had a way of prying open cracks in their polished images. And sometimes, when the cameras were off, he saw the truth. A truth that would never make it into gossip columns or glossy magazines. Carson himself wasn't a saint. His marriages were troubled, his temper legendary, and his drinking often the subject of whispered conversations. But compared to some of the stars he rubbed shoulders with, Carson's demons seemed tame. He witnessed behavior from Hollywood icons that was cruel, destructive, even evil. The tragedy of the Golden Age is that it built idols on pedestals while hiding their darkness in the shadows. Carson knew this better than anyone, and when he chose to reveal what he knew, the facade of glamour cracked wide open. Through offhand comments, sharp monologues, and candid conversations, Carson pulled back the curtain on 9 celebrities whose legacies were far darker than the public wanted to believe. What he exposed was not just scandal, but the rot at the heart of Hollywood's so-called golden years, the beloved star who was a monster off-screen. One of the most shocking revelations came when Carson spoke about a golden age celebrity who had once been hailed as the perfect gentleman, a movie star known for his charm, his smile, and his romantic roles. On screen, he embodied everything America wanted from its leading men. Women swooned, men admired him, and the studios marketed him as the definition of elegance. But Carson had seen behind that mask, and what he revealed made jaws drop. According to Carson, this man's off-screen life was a nightmare. Behind closed doors, he was abusive, verbally, physically, and emotionally. Crew members whispered about his cruelty on set. Co-stars, especially women, described how his temper would flare without warning. He belittled, insulted, and sometimes physically intimidated those who couldn't fight back. While the studios polished his image, the people who worked with him lived in fear. Carson hinted at these truths in his monologues, carefully cloaking his words in humor. He would crack a joke about the star's temper, about the way he liked to rehearse his fight scenes at home. The audience laughed, unaware of the darkness behind the punchline. But insiders knew exactly what Carson meant. It was his way of exposing the hypocrisy of Hollywood without directly saying the words that could end his career. Over the years, more evidence emerged to back Carson's claims. Co-stars who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Crew members recounted horror stories from sets where this so-called gentleman would humiliate or terrorize them. In private, Carson was blunt. He called the man evil. He had watched him smile for the cameras while knowing the truth. That behind that smile was a bully who left a trail of broken spirits. The tragedy was that audiences never fully turned on this star. His legacy remained largely intact, the studio system's protective shield too strong to break completely. But Carson's words planted a seed of doubt, forcing fans to ask themselves, how well do we really know the idols we worship? If the man who charmed millions on screen could be so cruel in real life, what did that say about the entire Golden Age? Carson's revelation was more than gossip. It was a warning, a reminder that Hollywood's glamour was a mask, and that behind it, some of the most beloved figures of the time were capable of real cruelty. The comic genius who hid a dark addiction. Another celebrity Carson exposed was one the world adored for his humor. He was the clown of his generation, a man whose slapstick antics and quick wit made audiences roar with laughter. Children loved him, adults respected him, and critics praised him as one of the most talented entertainers alive. On screen, he seemed harmless, even innocent, the kind of man who could trip over a chair and make an entire theater laugh. But behind the laughter Carson revealed was a darkness fueled by addiction. Carson himself understood the lure of alcohol. He had battled drinking for years, and he knew how fame and pressure could drive someone to seek escape in a bottle. But what he saw in this comic genius was different. It wasn't just indulgence, it was destruction. The man was consumed by his addiction. Behind the scenes, he was erratic, unreliable, and at times violent. His co-workers walked on eggshells, never knowing if they'd be greeted with laughter or rage. Carson shared sly jokes about this star's drinking during his monologues. He'd mention how the man never met a bar he didn't like, or how he couldn't tell the difference between a pratfall and a blackout. Audiences chuckled, thinking it was all part of the fun. But those who knew the truth recognized the sting in Carson's humor. He wasn't just mocking, he was exposing. The addiction wasn't limited to alcohol. Rumors swirled of other substances, of late-night binges that left him incoherent the next morning. Carson once hinted in conversation with a guest that the man's best performances were for the bartender, not the camera. The remark drew laughter on air, but it cut deeply into the truth. The tragedy of this revelation was how much it tainted the laughter. Fans who adored this comic genius began to see his routines differently. The pratfalls, the exaggerated stumbles, the wide-eyed chaos. Was it always just an act, or was it sometimes the reflection of a man too drunk to stand straight? What they thought was comedy might have been a cry for help. Carson didn't stop there. He pointed out how the industry enabled the addiction. Studio executives covered up his absences, co-stars were pressured into silence, and the media looked away. The star was too valuable, too beloved for anyone to risk the truth coming out. And so, his addiction deepened, destroying marriages, friendships, and his health. By the time the public fully understood, it was too late. The comic genius was a shell of himself, his once brilliant timing dulled by years of abuse. Carson's words echoed long after, not as jokes, but as warnings. He had tried, in his way, to tell the world. He had seen the evil of enabling, the way an industry could let a man destroy himself for the sake of profit. In exposing this celebrity, Carson didn't just tarnish an icon. He revealed a pattern Hollywood would sacrifice anyone, even its brightest stars, as long as the money kept flowing. And in that sacrifice, what was left was tragedy disguised as entertainment, the beloved actress whose charm hid a ruthless streak. In Hollywood's golden years, audiences adored the silver screen's radiant actresses. They were the faces of elegance, glamour, and innocence, the women who embodied romance and sophistication in every frame. Among them was one star who seemed untouchable. She dazzled with her beauty, her laughter charmed audiences, and her carefully cultivated image made her appear almost saint-like. Yet Johnny Carson, with his razor-sharp instincts and insider access, saw a very different reality behind the camera. Carson hinted in more than one monologue that this actress was far from the angelic figure fans believed her to be. He would crack lines about her, knowing how to smile while sharpening her knives, or joke that she was sweet only until the cameras stopped rolling. The audience laughed, thinking it was lighthearted banter. But those who worked in the industry knew he was hinting at something darker, a ruthless streak that left countless people scarred. Behind the soft gowns and romantic leads, she was a woman who devoured rivals. Hollywood in that era was already cutthroat, especially for women who were often pitted against one another for roles. But this actress thrived on that competition in ways that bordered on cruelty. She spread rumors about co-stars to undermine them, sabotaged careers with whispered lies, and used her influence with studio executives to ensure others were pushed out of the spotlight. More than one rising actress saw her career derailed after, coincidentally, clashing with her. Carson was particularly skilled at exposing this kind of hypocrisy. He would tease her about always landing the leading role, or quip about how directors mysteriously kept dropping her rivals. To the average viewer, it was just playful ribbing. But for Hollywood insiders, it was a wink and a nod, proof that Carson knew what many whispered in private, that the sweet exterior hid a manipulative, vindictive streak. Even more chilling were the accounts from people who worked directly with her. Crew members described her as dismissive and cruel, treating them like servants rather than colleagues. Co-stars recalled how she would deliberately mess up takes to make them look bad or whisper cutting insults just before the cameras rolled. She cultivated an image of perfection at the expense of those around her, and Carson, who had interviewed her countless times, grew increasingly cynical about her angel act. Perhaps the most damning stories revolved around her private relationships. Publicly, she was portrayed as a devoted wife, a loyal partner, or a woman unlucky in love, depending on the studio's narrative. But Carson knew the truth, that she treated lovers and friends with the same cold calculation she applied to her career. More than one partner reportedly described her as emotionally abusive, manipulative, and obsessed with control. What made her evil in Carson's eyes wasn't just ambition. Ambition can be excused, even admired. It was the joy she seemed to take in destroying others. Carson once described her, off-camera, as someone who didn't just want to win. She wanted everyone else to lose. That distinction is crucial. She wasn't simply a competitor in Hollywood's brutal system. She thrived on cruelty. For audiences, the revelation was devastating. They had believed in her carefully constructed image. They had watched her smile on talk shows, cry on screen, and deliver heartfelt interviews about love and sacrifice. But Carson's exposure of her ruthless nature shattered that illusion. She wasn't the golden goddess of the silver screen. She was a predator hiding behind sequins and smiles. The tragedy of her story lies in the way Hollywood enabled her. The studio system loved her manipulation because it kept her on top, and when she was on top, the money poured in. So the executives turned a blind eye. Her cruelty became just another tool for profit, and while audiences wept over her romantic roles, the people who worked with her wept for very different reasons. Carson's brilliance was in knowing how to expose her without ever directly naming the crime. He let the mask slip just enough for the world to glimpse the monster beneath the beauty. And once you saw that glimpse, you could never watch her films the same way again.
It's been a long time, you and me.
Yes, yeah. Well, people are starting to talk.
You look just as good as ever.
The Hollywood hero who was a tyrant in real life. If the glamorous actress represented the cruelty hidden in smiles, the next celebrity Carson exposed revealed the danger of unchecked power. This man was one of the most beloved leading men of his generation. He played heroes, cowboys, soldiers, roles that defined masculinity for millions of Americans. He was the man every guy wanted to be and every woman wanted to be with. On screen, he stood for justice, loyalty, and honor. But according to Carson, off-screen he was the exact opposite, a tyrant who abused his power and left destruction in his wake. Carson's jokes about him were sharper, more biting. He would quip about how this star always liked to be the sheriff, even when the cameras weren't rolling, or laugh about how never knew the difference between a stage fight and a real one. To the casual viewer, it was harmless humor. But industry insiders caught the sting. They knew Carson was pulling back the curtain on a man who ruled sets with fear and treated those beneath him like dirt. Accounts from crew members painted a disturbing picture. He berated assistants, humiliated extras, and demanded obedience from everyone around him. Directors and producers tolerated his behavior because he was a box office guarantee. But those who worked under him described it as hell. He would scream at grips for moving too slowly, threaten stuntmen if they made him look bad, and openly mock costume designers and makeup artists. His authority on set was absolute, and he wielded it with cruelty. Co-stars, especially women, suffered even more. Behind his polished image as a charming hero, he was known to harass female colleagues, belittle their talent, and in some cases demand compliance to maintain their careers. The studio system, eager to protect its golden goose, silenced complaints and buried scandals. His victims had no power, no voice, no chance against the machine that protected him. Carson detested hypocrisy, and nothing enraged him more than seeing a man worshipped as a hero while behaving like a tyrant. He used his platform to pierce the illusion. Without naming specifics, he let the public know that the man they saw on screen was an act, that in reality, this hero was closer to a villain. His monologues carried a bitterness when the star's name came up, his jokes edged with something more than humor. It was disdain. What made this revelation even more tragic is how completely the public refused to see it at the time. Audiences adored him too much. The fantasy of the strong, moral hero was too powerful to break. Carson knew he couldn't topple the man outright. Hollywood would never allow it. But he planted doubts. He let people laugh, then wonder why the laughter felt uneasy. As years passed, more evidence emerged. Biographies and memoirs revealed the truth Carson had been hinting at all along. The star's children described a father who was cold, distant, and controlling. Former colleagues shared stories of his cruelty. The myth of the heroic leading man crumbled, replaced by the truth of a tyrant who had been allowed to abuse his power unchecked. Carson's decision to expose him was not without risk. This star was still powerful during Carson's reign, and mocking him could have backfired. But Carson believed the truth mattered more than preserving illusions. He saw himself as a kind of cultural prosecutor, using humor as his weapon, the Tonight Show desk as his courtroom. And in the case of this so-called hero, Carson declared him guilty of the worst Hollywood crime, pretending to be a savior while acting like a monster. The sadness of it all is that his legacy remains complicated. Some still worship his films, refusing to let go of the image of the noble hero. Others can't watch them without remembering Carson's sharp words, the whispers of crew members, the testimonies of family. For those who know the truth, the man on screen is forever tainted by the man behind the mask, and that was Carson's greatest gift and curse. He didn't just make people laugh, he made them question. He forced them to look beyond the glamour of the golden age and see the darkness festering underneath. With this revelation, as with the others, Carson reminded the world that Hollywood's heroes were often villains in disguise. The comedian who laughed on stage and destroyed off it.
Talk show, in your opinion, you're Mr. Talk Show.
To plug this book, to plug this movie.
Okay, and if I would do that,
what else are you here for?
That's what I'm asking. If I would do that, your attitude would be disdain.
Hollywood loves its clowns. The Golden Age especially adored the entertainers who could make audiences roar with laughter. These comedians weren't just actors, they were cultural comfort food in times of war, recession, and change. One particular comic genius stood out among them, a man with boundless energy, sharp timing, and the ability to transform any room into a carnival of laughter. He was adored by millions. His routines became iconic. His catchphrases echoed across generations. To the audience, he was harmless, joyful, even childlike. But to Johnny Carson, who knew what happened when the cameras stopped rolling, this man was something far darker, a predator cloaked in comedy. Carson's jokes about him were sly but sharp. He'd quip that the comic never ran out of energy, unless he was apologizing the next morning, or that laughter was the only thing he didn't steal. The audience roared, never realizing the venom underneath. Carson wasn't just mocking drunken antics or ego. He was hinting at cruelty, manipulation, and destruction that played out offstage. Behind the smile and slapstick was a man addicted to chaos. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and treated colleagues like props in his own twisted show. Crew members described the way he would explode in rage if a joke didn't land perfectly, berating assistants for mistakes that weren't theirs. Writers who worked on his projects recalled how he would humiliate them in front of others, taking their material and then mocking them for being unfunny. He thrived on power, using his fame to crush anyone who dared challenge him. But Carson hinted at something even darker, the way this comedian treated his loved ones. While audiences believed he was the life of the party, those close to him saw a man capable of cruelty. Wives and partners spoke of his temper, the way his laughter would turn to shouting, the way he wielded control not through charm but intimidation. Carson, who had navigated his own troubled marriages, knew the difference between flaws and evil. And in this case, he saw a man who used comedy not as art, but as a mask. The most chilling stories, whispered in the corners of Hollywood, involved the way this comedian pried on those beneath him. Young performers desperate for mentorship found themselves manipulated, their careers used as bargaining chips for his amusement. Carson, with his insider knowledge, knew this wasn't just rumor, it was reality. He sharpened his monologues accordingly, painting the comic as a teacher who always wanted too much in return. The studio audiences laughed at the line, never realizing it was a warning. Addiction fueled the destruction. He could never say no, to drinks, to bets, to women, to anything that fed his ego. His self-destruction bled into everyone around him. Directors dreaded working with him because production spiraled into chaos. Fellow actors avoided him unless forced, knowing they'd be the butt of his cruel improvisations. And yet, the public adored him. They saw only the pratfalls, the grins, the goofy routines. Carson detested that kind of duplicity. He hated the idea that the nation worshipped a clown who ruined lives behind the curtain. So he used his stage to let the mask slip. He ridiculed the comic's excesses, mocked his broken marriages, and hinted at the trail of damage left behind. And though he never outright named the evil, his sharpest viewers began to suspect. The laughter turned uneasy. The tragedy is that this comic genius was never truly held accountable. Hollywood shielded him, just as it had shielded so many of its stars. Studios made too much money off his antics to let the truth destroy him. The cruelty was dismissed as centricity, the abuse hidden as private matters. By the time the truth began leaking into biographies and documentaries years later, it was too late. The public had already enshrined him as a legend. Carson, however, knew the truth long before it was fashionable to say it. He saw the mask tore at its edges and showed the world glimpses of the darkness beneath. And in doing so, he exposed one of Hollywood's ugliest truths. Sometimes the funniest man in the room is also the cruelest. The crooner with a voice of gold and a heart of stone. In the glittering age of Hollywood, no figure carried more power than the smooth-voiced crooners who defined romance for an entire generation. Their songs filled radios, their faces filled magazines, and their presence made audiences swoon. One of them, a singer so beloved that his records sold in the millions, was adored as a national treasure. His ballads played at weddings, his smile was plastered on posters, and his charm seemed endless. To fans, he was the voice of love itself. But to Johnny Carson, who had spent years watching this man's carefully curated act, he was something else entirely ruthless, cold, and cruel. Carson's jokes about him were sly, but they always cut deep. He'd joke about the singers, love songs that ended when the lights went out, or quip that he had a voice for romance and fists for everyone else. Audiences chuckled, thinking it was a playful jab at a notorious temper. But Carson wasn't just poking fun. He was signaling that the idol who crooned about love and tenderness lived with a heart of stone. Behind closed doors, this crooner was infamous for his violence and cruelty. Friends described his volcanic temper, the way he would erupt over the smallest slight. Stories swirled about bar fights, about crew members who felt his fists, about women who endured his wrath in private. His charm in public was weaponized in private, a mask that hid a man who wielded control with intimidation. Carson had a front row seat to the hypocrisy. The crooner often appeared on The Tonight Show, performing his latest ballads, charming the studio audience, smiling for the cameras. But once the applause faded, Carson had seen the change. He noticed the way assistants were snapped at, the way waitstaff were treated as disposable, the way every interaction revolved around ego. Johnny had a sharp eye for human behavior, and in this singer, he saw a man who believed he could sing his way out of any consequence. The most disturbing stories involved his personal relationships. Lovers and wives described a man who was controlling, manipulative, and often violent. Some recounted how he would charm them in public, only to unleash cruelty behind closed doors. Carson, who had battled his own demons in relationships, didn't excuse flaws, but what he saw in this crooner went beyond flaws. It was a pattern of abuse, a streak of cruelty that ran too deep to ignore. Hollywood, of course, protected him. He was too valuable, too beloved. His records sold. His films drew crowds, and his name filled stadiums. The industry turned a blind eye, chalking up his temper to passion, dismissing the rumors as exaggerations. But Carson refused to buy into the myth. He used humor as his weapon, slipping barbed truths into his monologues, making sure the world heard whispers of the man behind the songs. One of his most cutting lines came after the crooner was involved in yet another public altercation. Carson, looking into the camera with his signature smirk, said, "He sings about love because he spends the rest of his life trying to find it in a bottle or a fight." The audience laughed nervously, but insiders recognized the sting of truth. Johnny had pulled the curtain back just enough to reveal the monster hidden in the tuxedo. The tragedy of this crooner's story is how long the mask stayed on. Fans went to their graves believing in the romance of his voice, never realizing the cruelty of his heart. Biographers and former colleagues would later confirm what Carson had hinted at all along, that the man who serenaded America was also a man who destroyed the lives of those closest to him. Carson's exposure of this star wasn't just about one man. It was about the corruption of an entire system that allowed a violent, abusive figure to be worshipped as a symbol of love. For Johnny, the hypocrisy was unbearable, and so he did what he always did best. He made a joke that wasn't really a joke, leaving his audience to laugh first and wonder later. In the end, the crooner's voice may have been golden, but his soul was tarnished beyond repair, and Johnny Carson made sure the world would never forget that truth.